Namaskar, hello and a very warm welcome viewers. You're watching Samvaad with your host Kriti Mishra. We know him as the youngest chief economic advisor. His economic surveys nudged us to understand Thalinomics. He suggested measures that led to India emerging from the once-in-a-century COVID crisis with strong macroeconomic fundamentals. Today, he speaks to us as the Executive Director India at the International Monetary Fund. Mr. K.V. Subramanian, welcome to Sansad TV and thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you very much, Kriti, for inviting me to share my thoughts again.
Well, the global economic outlook is even gloomier than projected last month, says the International Monetary Fund. Tightening monetary policy triggered by high and broad-based inflation, weak growth momentum in China, and ongoing supply disruptions and food insecurity caused by Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Is a global recession imminent, or we have already plunged into it?
I think the global economy is in such an unprecedented situation of uncertainty, something that I have certainly not witnessed during my time of tracking the global economy. If you look at inflation, I think synchronized high inflation in the advanced economies of this nature for the first time since the 1970s. Yeah. Synchronized monetary tightening across the advanced economies since the 1980s. The dollar being so strong as it is for the first time since 2002, not necessarily because of the strength of the US economy, but more because of economic uncertainty and the resultant flight to safety and the home bias of American investors. Similarly, in China, for the first time since 1976, if you leave aside the COVID year, very, very sort of moderate growth or very low growth for the first time since 1976. When you put it all together, I think the overall economic situation looks very uncertain and possibly gloomy as well. I think if you look at the layoffs that are happening, in the US, we here at ISB, also have seen many global firms deciding not to recruit for, Indian firms are compensating, but many global firms are, some of the big marquee names are not coming. I think that is all clearly indicative of, troubled times for the global economy. That said, I will also mention, I have not seen this kind of wedge between the economic prospects for India versus the rest of the world either. And I think to me, that is really the silver lining in what seems to be a very dark cloud, outside of India.
Well, we'll talk about India in just a bit, but you talked about uncertainty and also you haven't answered my question on recession, sir.
I think either we are already in recession or we are certainly going to, be in a recession. That's why I was mentioning about, firms deciding not to recruit or laying off people. These are clearly symptomatic of, a recession. And I think it's also quite likely there will be a very synchronized one. And I think Europe may be in a tighter spot compared to the US. I think the US labor markets have done pretty well post-COVID, but that has not been the case in Europe. So I think, we are certainly headed towards a recession if we are not already in it for the globe.
All right, so let's talk about solution. So around 25% of emerging market economies are in distress. Even countries with strong fundamentals have become vulnerable. Of course, we've been talking about fiscal policy measures and strong buffers. But how do we counter economic shocks? As you said that we're living in this uncertain world.
So I think when we look at it for the global economy, right, I would like to humbly state that, some of the measures that India adopted for, itself post-COVID, there are important learnings there for the rest of the world. For instance, one of the key distinguishing aspects of India's COVID economic policy was the wonderful balance that we struck between demand and supply side measures. Not only did we do enough on the demand side by maximizing the buck, taxpayers' But at the same time, we also, recognize that supply side factors are incredibly important, because do understand, Kriti, that if, for instance, all the monetary tightening is focused and, just brings down demand, the amount of tightening that will be required will have a significant impact and is already having an impact on growth. If these were accompanied with supply side measures as well, some of the supply side difficulties that have been encountered, post the Ukraine war, if those were worked on, I think, in fact, the rest of the world should have worked on supply side issues even during COVID, which they have not. And that is why they are witnessing the kind of inflation that they are seeing today. But even today with the Ukraine war, I think the supply side focus is not there. So to me, it is clearly obvious that, balancing both the supply side and the demand side measures can really help in both easing inflation, at the same time not having to pay such a large cost in terms of growth, for easing inflation. And I think that's something which India has done well. And, I would think that the rest of the world can learn a lot from India's template, that we followed post-COVID.
So you're talking about supply side issues. Let me add to that. Shrinking economic output, higher unemployment, and lower consumer spending. What does the 2008 financial crisis tell us about today? Because the comparisons are inevitable.
So I think that's a good question, Kriti. See, the key distinction is that the 2008 financial crisis, as the crisis itself was named, stemmed from the financial sector. And one of the characteristics, this has been highlighted both by academic research and by research by the IMF, World Bank, etc., is that when a crisis originates from the financial sector, the overhang of that on the real economy is very, very long. And I think in India, we also witnessed it. Some of the bad lending that happened till 2013 had a significant overhang and therefore led to the slowdown, pre-COVID as well. So I think there are enough instances to clearly demonstrate that when problems originate in the financial sector, they have a very, very long overhang on the real economy. That's one key distinction that we have to keep in mind, because this time around, the problems are not as much originating in the financial sector. But I will caveat one point, which is that the many emerging economies are actually, sort of seeing situations of excessive debt. India is not, in that situation. But many other economies, I think both the sovereign and the corporate sector may be, over leveraged, and therefore, impending problems in the financial sector may be something that will have to be watched. But that's the key difference, that the crisis has not originated from the financial sector. But second, I think if you look at the global financial crisis and contrast it to both COVID plus the Ukraine war, the primary crisis in the case of the global financial crisis was in demand. Demand suffered significantly, but it's not as if people had to basically be told, don't go to work, sit at home, or that we'll basically, sort of do a lockdown. These were the things, that clearly demonstrated to us. And that's why India recognized very early that the COVID crisis will have an important effect on the supply side, because if people don't go to produce, obviously production will come down significantly. This is over and above what happens due to, layoffs, etc. But, at the outset itself, telling people to sit at home, had its impact on supply. To that, if you add, Ukraine, for instance, is a big supplier of many, commodities, and that has clearly been impacted, which also means a big supply side shock. That was not the case as much with the global financial crisis. So I think these are key differences. The template that was followed a lot, significant monetary easing and printing of money that was done during the global financial crisis. I think many governments, tried sort of replicating the same or copy pasting the same during COVID and now during the Ukraine war as well. But what we have to understand is that the nature of the crisis is quite different. One, it has not originated from the financial sector, and second, there are important supply side issues. Unless those supply side issues are basically taken care of, I think just trying to do everything from the demand side will have a significant impact on growth. And so the cost that one will have to pay for lowering inflation actually will be very high decline in growth.
But sir, that adds to our worry. This is actually a very gloomy picture. So from Great Depression to Great Pandemic, where are we heading now?
I think for the global economy, I am afraid that, that I think it is really looking to be in a tight spot. I think the easing of the Ukraine crisis, and that is far more political than economic, is I think a precondition for a lot of these dark clouds that are clearly, that have captured the global economy for them to ease. I don't think that the economic uncertainty will just blow away unless the key factor right now, which has basically, which has led to these supply side issues, unless that is taken care of. As I also have mentioned already, I think there's a significant policy overhang as well. Yes. The mistakes that have been made during COVID and are continuing to be made now as well, which is not adequate focus on the supply side, is also adding to the trouble. I think that's something which has to be recognized. Do keep in mind that, in democracies, supply side reforms or supply side measures are far harder to implement than demand side measures. Supply side measures require foresight. They also actually require courage of conviction to be able to sort of invest. For instance, if you're doling out money, right, or you're raising interest rates, for instance, those are things that don't have sort of, they can be easily explained, and they're easier compared to saying, let's say, we will do capital expenditures. The effect of this will manifest, let's say, 6, 8 or 10 months, or maybe even a year after, right. And therefore require some patience. But the effect is far, far greater. In India and in the rest of the world as well, research has clearly, highlighted that the fiscal multiplier, which is basically economists' jargon, for, yes. If I put in a rupee or a dollar into the economy, how much does the economic, how much gets added to the economy? That fiscal multiplier is significantly higher for capital expenditures and supply side measures than it is for just myopic measures like doling out money or, reducing or just focusing on demand. But I think this is where the political will to sort of, take some hard steps on the supply side will have to be shown. If the world economy and the policymakers, heed to this advice and take a careful look at what India did, and therefore, the lessons from the same, they will realize that I think a good balance between the supply and demand side measures will actually ease inflation and also not have as much of a cost on the growth itself.
Absolutely. Let's hope that they actually heed to this advice. But let's talk about the silver lining in this overall gloomy situation. India deserves to be called a bright spot on this otherwise dark horizon because it has been a fastest growing economy, and even during these difficult times. But most importantly, this growth is underpinned by structural reforms. How do you see things panning out for India since it has held its own despite the global meltdown, if I may say so?
I think India, as you rightly pointed out, Kriti, clearly stands out as a beacon of hope and, as the bright spot in the global economy. Given that we are the 5th largest economy, when we grow at 6.5% to 7%, or maybe closer to 7%, in a world economy that may actually be, in recession, I think the gulf between those growth prospects is just, is clearly demonstrated through just those numbers. Negative growth versus 6.5% to 7%. I think I don't need to say anything more, to sort of underline that point. But it is, equally important, and what you mentioned, that this has been underpinned by not only structural reforms, but very, sort of sagacious policy that was implemented during COVID. I've already mentioned, and I think there's a lot has been written, at least in India, on the fact that we actually spent the fiscal space that we had. Do keep in mind, unlike a lot of the advanced economies, we did not have the luxury of, the kind of fiscal space that the United States had, because of it, having dollar as a reserve currency. But that fiscal space, we actually utilized it very, very carefully by really maximizing the bang for the buck. We also recognized very early, between March to May 2020, simple thing that, if you're asking people to stay home, not go for work, then obviously production will be impacted. One more key thing is that, unlike, for instance, let's say the lights in our room, we can turn them on and off and the light comes back immediately. But that's not the case with the economy. If you shut down the economy, let's say for a month or, a few or a couple of months, then the economy does not come back roaring back, to its previous level immediately. It takes time. And that is where the supply side problems result, because many, entities in the supply chain get impacted. And, we recognized it early in around between March to May 2020 itself. And that is exactly what happened. And therefore, we, implemented enormous supply side measures, including the reforms as well. And I think the growth potential for India, therefore, clearly looks much better. You would recall, about 2 years back, I had mentioned, I had not only predicted the V-shaped recovery, but also said that in this decade, India will have 7% plus growth. And I'm happy to note that many of the other multilateral agencies actually are now coming around to the same view, what I had mentioned 2 years back. That is because of the policy measures we've taken, also because of the structural reforms that have been taken. I'll just mention a last point just to highlight, how a lot of the commentary on India, especially from those who are oftentimes not as, carefully observing India on the ground. I would want to comment that when I, for instance, had joined North Block in December 2018, a lot of commentators were saying that, there are structural problems that are impacting India's growth, that India may have only 5%, growth, or that may be the new normal that India may have to settle down to. I had pointed out then itself that there is nothing structurally wrong with the Indian economy, that the slowdown is only because of the financial sector problems that basically, stemmed from the bad lending up until 2013. And I think if you see today, the fact that we are basically projected to grow at 7% plus growth, in this decade, and there are some commentators who are also saying this is India's century. I think, if there was something structurally wrong with the Indian economy, 7% plus growth for this decade or this century itself, I think it's obvious cannot manifest. So that clearly tells you that a lot of commentary, on India, both pre-COVID and during COVID, was not, was clearly off the mark. I think that it was far more negative than it needed to be. I think, and there is an important signal there for people who, regularly follow such commentaries, to be driven by far more research-driven, assessments than just narratives that are not as carefully driven by research.
In my introduction, you may recall, I said you nudged us to understand Thalinomics. You also nudged us to understand V-shaped recovery, something that we are experiencing right now. But let's also talk about the Achilles heel for Indian economy, the manufacturing sector. Now, the government has been talking about Atmanirbhar Bharat, making manufacturing globally competitive. Do you think we can reap benefits of China +1 strategy?
Yeah, Kriti, so I would actually want to remind, the last press conference that I had held in my capacity as the chief economic advisor. Viewers can go and check the video of that press conference. In that, I'd shown some data that actually clearly shows that India can indeed strengthen its manufacturing. And so the evidence that I provided was, if you look at from 2014 onwards till 2018, 19, I think 2014 to 2019, if you look at the CAGR for manufacturing value added, that has been much higher than China during that period. And it is not an accident, because the second part of that particular piece of evidence was that This has manifested because we've actually, taken important steps both on the power sector in terms of the, reliability of power and the cost of power, and also on the, logistics side. And these very well, we know these are, I think we know very well that these are important inputs into manufacturing. Apart from that, we've taken many other measures, labor reforms, for instance, which actually can really enable, high quality labor at, reasonable costs for manufacturing. Secondly, the economies of scale, the phenomenon of dwarfism that we had highlighted in the 2018-19 economic survey. If you look at the PLI scheme and the change in the MSME definitions, these are clearly, intended to, address that phenomenon of dwarfism, because that really makes a difference when you have average cost, or when you have the, the total cost of the firm, which includes the fixed cost, when that is spread over a larger denominator, when firms grow, then the average cost goes down, and that makes firms competitive, that they can therefore go and compete in the global markets, also in the domestic markets from, with imports that are coming in. And I think there has been a concerted strategy, through the Make in India, to work on many of these structural bottlenecks that was hobbling the manufacturing sector. And early evidence, which is what I referred to, clearly shows that I think the effects are coming in. I think to some extent, you have to remember that the trend will be for manufacturing, output to increase, and the percentage itself to increase. Though there will be some blips here and there, but that trend will continue because of the policy focus. I remain extremely optimistic about the growth of the manufacturing sector in India.
Well, with that optimism, and before we end this conversation, India is soon going to head the G20. Now, it is very, very significant because New Delhi will get to anchor a very strong economic bloc. What are the challenges and opportunities for India?
So I think let me, given my my own personality, I always like looking at the opportunity first and then the challenge. So I think when we look at the opportunity, I want to, draw attention to a couple of philosophical aspects that distinguishes India from the rest of the world. If there is one country that has never ever been an aggressor, in the in any geopolitical, or we've never gone and annexed, it has been India.
Absolutely.
Second, if there is one country that has never ever defaulted on any of its obligations, even in 1991, when we faced our lowest point, we actually shipped gold to the Bank of England and to the Bank of Japan. Unlike many other countries, emerging economies that have defaulted on their obligations, we've never defaulted. And I actually have observed this. There is bipartisan support for this, because it does not come from any economic thinking. It comes from a very deep spiritual ethos that basically drives India's thinking. When you take these two aspects into account, India, I think, it can be a far, far more trusted leader for the world than possibly any other, country can be. Also, as you would remember, Kriti, in the 2019-20 economic survey, which I had written on ethical wealth creation, if you look at the model that has prevailed in India historically, which led to India occupying, more than 1/3 of world's GDP up until 1750-80, that is 3/4 of known economic history, it has always been one of dharmic capitalism. It has never been one of rapacious capitalism. We've always married the invisible hand of markets, which is another way of saying private enterprise, with the hand of ethics or dharma. And that is why we have always been a country that has followed dharmic capitalism. I think the opportunity really is for India to show the way to the rest of the world, to say basically this is something that has worked. Whether you go and read the Arthashastra by Kautilya, or down south you read, for instance, Tirukkural by Saint Tiruvalluvar. These ideas have actually been part of our ethos and have really provided spectacular success in the past. And I think India now is going back to that. So India can really be a sort of, a trendsetter in really, advocating or showing the dharmic capitalism model for the rest of the world. To me, that is the big opportunity, and leading in a very trustworthy manner, not being not really following, sort of those that some of the other countries may have actually not necessarily imbibed as well. I think the challenge really is for us to, really demonstrate this aspect. And therefore, I think the focus on growth, has to be, we have to double down and show that this model of dharmic capitalism actually works and provide the evidence. I think a lot of people are talking about the potential for this to work in this, including me, I've talked about, and I think some of that potential is starting to be realized, but we have to do it over a long period, because if we look at some of the, steps, if we take the financial crisis that we encountered, leading up till 2018, that is not consistent with dharmic capitalism. So I think we have to actually show this model. At the same time, we also have to demonstrate that that growth can be inclusive.
Right.
I think what we've shown through the direct benefit transfers,
Absolutely.
the Aadhaar, the JAM Trinity, again, is also, I think, a significant opportunity. I think that is also something where we have to double down to show that we can make growth inclusive and not just depend on the trickle down, which is what a lot of the Western models for capitalism have actually spoken about. I think on the challenges, explicit challenges, we do have to take into account that, some of the narrative that prevails on India, in the rest of the world is not necessarily reflecting the strength and the vibrancy of the Indian economy, and overall the Indian society itself. I think that is something, in disseminating, the vibrancy and the strength of India's economy and society. I think we have to actually, sort of focus on that. At the same time, in the short run, I think I will, fail in my duty if I don't highlight, given our current account deficit, which is, likely to be in excess of 3%, and given what I mentioned, that the global economy is in an unprecedented period of uncertainty.
Yes.
While it is the case that for India, if you look historically, just current account deficit has never created any macroeconomic problem. It is always when it's been a double whammy, in other words, double-digit inflation combined with a very high current account deficit. Only that has led to a macroeconomic problem. But I think that is in the past. Given the fact that we are witnessing such uncertainty in the globe, we have to be careful. I think on the external front, and in the next 8 to 10 months, make sure that we basically keep our watch guard, sort of very, very active.
Well,
that's
absolutely.
basically what I would summarize as the opportunity and the challenge for India as the president of G20.
Well, those are very important arguments and very valid points that you made. My questions could go on endlessly, but I'm so sorry, I'm completely out of time. Thank you so much for joining us, sir. And you're going to assume charge. All the very best.
Thank you very much.
Well, viewers, that's all I could pack for you in this edition. Thanks for watching and stay tuned to Sansad TV. Goodbye from my side for now.